With the nation at war and daily reports of corruption in Congress, the political landscape is anything but smooth for those in Washington as we begin this new year. Also, should the U.S. military be paying for positive press in Iraq? It's the year ahead and buying good news next on The Body Politic. Good evening and welcome to The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein, Professor of History and Dean of Arts and Humanities here at the University of California, San Diego. With so much news coming out of the nation's capital, we decided to turn to an expert to forecast which issues will have the greatest impact on politics in 2006. That expert is Bruce Cain, a professor of political science and director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. Bruce is also the director of the University of California Washington Center in Washington, D.C., where he joins us now. Welcome, Bruce.
Glad to be here.
Well, Bruce, is it safe to say that the major issue this year for the country is the war in Iraq?
I think it's pretty clear that Iraq is the dominant issue and the issue on which this administration will ultimately be judged by history. It has had, in the early years, it's been the reason that George Bush has had so much power in Washington as everybody sort of coalesced around him. And now, in the last year and a half, it's been the issue that has really dragged down his popularity in the past.
Yes, his polls have deteriorated quite a bit. Do you anticipate major troop withdrawals during this coming year?
There's no question that we cannot maintain our current level of troop support in Iraq. The real question is how quickly do you withdraw the forces and what's the residual force that you leave in Iraq. The Democrats, or at least some parts of the Democratic Party, would like to see a much more rapid withdrawal and ultimately the removal of troops from Iraq completely, whereas the Republican Party is split between those who want to maintain the current level of troop level and those who are more sympathetic to the Democratic cause. I think this next year is going to be very critical in terms of what the administration does. Does it continue to adhere to the line that we have to stay there with a very heavy troop commitment for the next couple of years, or do they bow to the political pressures that are developing within their own ranks to reduce that level of commitment in Iraq to something considerably smaller to what it is right now?
Is it safe to say that this will be a unilateral process? In other words, you don't anticipate the U.S. going to the UN or looking to other allies to play a major role in a reconfiguration of the military effort there?
There's no question that we will ask other Arab nations and the United Nations to help us out. But we got in there unilaterally, and the world seems to be determined to let us handle it unilaterally. At this point, I believe that what the world is looking for and what the United States is looking for is for the Iraqis to take control of their situation. If you're relying on outside troops, the estimates of the number of troops that you would need are 500,000, 600,000 troops, which is far more than we could ever expect European allies or the United Nations to provide. So what really has to happen is the Iraqis have to take control of their own security situation. And that, of course, is the big debate. How quickly are they being trained? Can we keep the different militias from overtaking the security situation in Iraq, or can you form a unified army that can beat back the insurgency? That probably is the most critical question, not so much support from the outside and other nations.
Well, a related issue to the war in Iraq are the other activities of the U.S. administration with respect to the war on terrorism. And there's great controversy about domestic surveillance, domestic spying. Do you see that story reverberating through the course of 2006?
Inside Washington, that story is not going to go away. Perhaps nothing has angered the Congress more in the last 6 months than the discovery that the president was carrying out surveillance without warrants from the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This has really irritated Congress because it really does basically override Congress's mandate when it passed the law that set up the Fifth Court, and it basically says that the president is free to do whatever he thinks is appropriate in this war on terror, and he doesn't have to consult with Congress, and that Congress's war powers don't limit him. And this really upsets the players inside Washington. What I'm not sure of, and what we need to watch for the next year, is to what degree this resonates with public opinion and then plays out as an electoral issue, because process issues in general aren't as salient, don't mean as much to the average voter as they do to people that are actually inside government and are on a day-to-day basis dealing with one another. There's no question that this has great significance for the American system of government. The question is whether it resonates with voters in the upcoming election.
Well, to be sure, the controversy over domestic surveillance has made it difficult for the president to maintain support in the Congress, even within his own party. Now, a related issue there that really exploded in the news toward the end of 2005 concerned corruption in Congress. Now the revelations concerning Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist, and other members of Congress. How do you see that issue playing out in the months ahead?
I think a lot depends upon how many people and members of Congress are actually implicated in the FBI investigations. If it turns out that the number of 20 or 21, which we've seen in recent days, if it turns out to be that many congressmen who are in trouble legally as a result of this, and if they're disproportionately Republican, this could change the face of the 2006 midterm elections. But if it turns out to be just one or two members of Congress and then a few relatively anonymous staff people, then I think that issue will result in some lobbying reforms, but may not have any impact on the 2000 elections, or at least not enough to really make a difference, say, to give control to the Democrats.
Well, we've had some major impacts of this scandal in Southern California, of course. Randall Duke Cunningham, a senior member of Congress from the San Diego area, being forced to resign his position under indictment, and now with revelations about Representative Jerry Lewis in Orange County. You mentioned the upcoming midterm congressional elections. Obviously, a major test for any president, and a major test for the Republican Party as they have control of both houses. Along with this issue of the corruption probes in Congress, how do you view the upcoming midterms? Do you think the Democrats are going to have a shot at gaining control, say, of the Senate, or will things stay pretty much as they are?
As things stand right now, I think most people would be very surprised if the Democrats don't make inroads in both the Senate and the House elections. And it's not just the Abramoff scandal, it's also fuel prices and now heating prices. It's also the handling of Katrina. It's the weapons of mass destruction. It's all the various problems that the president and the administration have had over the last year. So it would be very surprising if on top of this and the historical record of a second-term president having a lot of trouble holding their congressional delegation in the second term, if all those things combined do not result in Democratic victories around the country, that will be a shocking result. The big question is, will there be enough losses on the Republican side to give the Democrats control of either the House or the Senate? And that's where the doubts arise. On the House side, they arise because of the redistrictings, which in most states have made Democratic and Republican incumbents relatively safe. Now, that's not to say that those advantages can't be overcome, but it's going to take some fairly serious dissatisfaction to make inroads into the advantages that Democratic and Republican incumbents have, rather, as a result of the redistricting. And on the Senate side, it will depend upon the degree to which some of the incumbents are weakened by the Abramoff scandals, and the degree to which the Senate is able to, the Democratic Senate challengers are able to fund good campaigns and run strong campaigns, because they're going to have to beat several incumbents in order to take those Senate seats. There aren't enough open seats for the Democrats to take in order for them to get control of the Senate.
Well, of course, the midterms as well, whatever their outcome, will give us some bellwether indications of what might occur in 2008 in the next presidential canvass. Take a look in your crystal ball. Will Hillary Clinton be the nominee of the Democratic Party?
I think you can't rule that out. I think there are a lot of Democrats around the country that would be very unhappy with that outcome, not because they so much dislike Hillary, but because they believe that Hillary would be a very weak candidate. Right now she has a huge advantage in the polls, and she has a huge advantage in the money, and she caught a break in the sense that her opponent on the Republican side in her Senate reelection campaign has dropped out, and the Republicans are struggling to find somebody even to run against her in New York. On the other hand, if you look at Hillary's favorable and unfavorable ratings, her unfavorable ratings are extremely high. They're over 40%, and the campaign hasn't even begun. She comes to the candidacy with an enormous amount of baggage, and I think a lot of Democrats would like to have a fresh start. They would like to look at a new face, a Mark Warner, a Senator Bayh, somebody who has won in red states and can show an ability to go after moderate and conservative voters. And Hillary probably can't do that.
And if I understand you correctly, Bruce, so you're suggesting that at least significant portions of the Democratic Party leadership are interested in candidates who will have, good footing in the so-called red states. That they really want someone who can make some inroads on these key states from the last presidential election. Yes. Exactly.
There's no question that a Democrat can win a New York and a California, but the real question is, can you win the Electoral College by winning the Ohios, the Pennsylvanias, the Floridas, the Tennessees, the states that sort of either lean towards the Republican side or lean towards the Democratic side, but they're sometimes called the purple states. And to win in those states, you've got to have a relatively conservative Democrat, somebody who is not too far out on social issues, and somebody who has won the confidence and can relate to red state voters. And that's why people are looking at some of the governors that have won in states such as Virginia, which is a Republican state. Mark Warner was able to win, be successful, and so successful that he was able to bring his lieutenant governor into the governor's position. Those are the kinds of people that many of the sort of Democratic Party operatives looking towards November 08 would rather see in there rather than Hillary.
Well, let's bring it a little closer to home for our California viewers. Speaking of politics, will Governor Schwarzenegger, Arnold Schwarzenegger, be able to achieve re-election? He suffered a rather bruising defeat with the key propositions he put on the ballot in the last election, and now he seems to be reconfiguring himself. How do you see the gubernatorial race here in California?
The one thing you have to remember is that Arnold doesn't have to get back to the 60 and 70% popularity range that he was in a year and a half ago. We have lots of history in California of governors getting reelected even though they're relatively unpopular. Pete Wilson and Gray Davis are good examples of that. What he really needs to aspire to is to move up from the sort of 35% favorability ratings that he's at right now to the 45% range. And his movement to the middle might well do that. It might well pick up some moderate Democrats and some center voters. The problem with the strategy of moving so abruptly to the middle is that he may alienate some of the base in his party. And the thing to watch over the next couple months, particularly as he unveils his shall we say, somewhat lavish plans for infrastructure development and for spending for the schools and for higher education, is whether he gets a revolt inside his own party from the fiscal conservatives, the Tom McClintocks. A revolt from the conservatives would really seal his fate. He can't afford to have a divided Republican Party, but he needs to get back to the 40% level. And on the Democratic side, we can look forward to a fairly bruising primary between Steve Wesley and Phil Angelides. And unless somebody steps in on the Democratic side and says, look, you guys can't just attack each other and leave yourself wasted and bloodied for the November race, you've got to focus your efforts on competing as to who can criticize the governor best. Unless somebody does that, we're going to repeat the history of the Democratic primaries of the past, where lots of money and lots of energy have been spent beating each other up, and then a weakened Democratic opponent goes forward towards an incumbent Republican governor. This is what happened when Pete Wilson was reelected, and this is what happened under George Dumasian. That pattern, the Democratic Party has to get out of that to have a chance. But from Arnold Schwarzenegger's point of view, if he could stay at about a 40% level and he can count on the Democrats to beat each other up, he has a chance of winning.
Well, it's clearly going to be a very interesting year ahead, Bruce. Thank you very much. Bruce Cain coming to us tonight from the UC Washington Center in Washington, D.C. We'll be in touch again soon, Bruce.
Good to see you.
Next up tonight, professors at UC San Diego who take issue with reports that the Pentagon paid for positive coverage in Iraq. When the Los Angeles Times reported that the U.S. military was paying Iraqi newspapers to run positive stories about the U.S. effort there, stories that were written by American troops but presented as the work of independent journalists, some people here at UC San Diego were upset. And they did what we've all been instructed to do. They took their complaint to Washington. For more on that, we have with us Gary Fields, an assistant professor of communication, and Robert Horwitz, chair of the Department of Communication here at the University of California, San Diego. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Gary, what happened? How did you take your complaint to Washington?
When this story first broke in the news media, it touched on many of the core themes of both teaching and research in our department. And it seemed that it touched on one of the main principles that we teach our students, that is the relationship of democracy and the free press. It seemed that there were many elements in this story that were very objectionable, and it also seemed to me that we had a particular responsibility as a communication department to speak out about this issue. I felt that I wasn't the only one and queried some of my colleagues about what kind of response we should make to this situation, and we decided that we should at least have a meeting about it, discuss it, and figure out what to do next. We had a meeting. We invited graduate students, faculty, and staff to the meeting, and we decided that the best course of action would be to write a letter to Senator Warner, the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, to express our concerns, to voice our objections to the practice, and to ask that he open public hearings about this so that the American people would learn more about what was actually going on. That's how we drafted this letter, which we sent on December 19th.
And have you had a formal reply to this letter? Has Senator Warner had anything to say?
Well, I called Senator Warner's office yesterday, actually, because we hadn't received a reply yet. And I talked to his chief of staff at the Armed Services Committee, a Mr. Sam Zaga. We learned that sending a letter is a little bit more complicated in terms of getting a reply. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks, first of all, for the letter to be screened for security reasons, so that the physical letter hasn't actually been received. But he does have a copy of our letter through email, and he informed me that his office is drafting a response.
Robert, let me ask you, obviously issues of information, propaganda, and mobilization of public sentiment are very profound in time of war. What precisely were you and your colleagues concerned about in what was obviously an effort by both the U.S. military and the federal government to try and maintain support for the war effort in Iraq?
Well, the war effort in Iraq is one thing. The war effort in the United States is another. And part of what's so awful about this is that as we have entered into Iraq, presumably to facilitate a democracy, one of the keystones of a democracy is a free press. One of the keystones of a free press is independent journalists who are not paid off by government, not disseminating propaganda. And here we have our government, in fact, they're teaching courses to Iraqi journalists on how to be a journalist in a free society. And now we also learn that at the same time, they're paying them off. They're paying newspapers to print stories that are written by people who work for the Lincoln Group, which is a subcontractor to the Department of Defense. And it just seems to me that it's not just the appearance of corruption, it is corruption itself.
Well, let's just take an historical perspective here for a moment. In World War II, of course, there were two agencies established in the federal government to deal specifically with information. One was the Office of Strategic Services, as sort of the forerunner of the CIA, which actually waged a kind of information warfare, among other things, against the enemies of the United States, planting disinformation and so forth. And then there was the Office of War Information, which was a federal unit set up to mold messages through the media, film, radio, the press, to convey information about the war effort and the aims of the war against the Axis powers. Obviously, you and your colleagues see a difference between the current situation and then, or maybe not. How do you see this current issue in relation to that historical experience?
Obviously, from World War II, you referenced World War II, conduct that's, war does not make illegal conduct, it doesn't legitimize illegal conduct. In my view, it also does not legitimize unethical conduct. These are practices that are intolerable here. Why should these practices be tolerated in Iraq? One of the stated goals of this, putting aside for a minute the morality and ethics of the war itself, I mean, one of the stated goals of this war is to construct a democracy in Iraq. It seems to me that undermining the basic principles of a free and independent media not only undermines that goal, but it undermines basic principles that we apparently in the United States stand for in terms of democracy. And again, these are practices that are not tolerated here. Why should they be tolerated there?
You know, I think your historical example is an interesting one, in large part because I don't think that there's any difference in the administration's mind between World War II and now. And in fact, I mean, it's not just Iraq where there have been planting stories. There have been all these reports where the administration has paid columnists to support the administration's agenda. Armstrong Williams is the one that we know about. And there have also been these stories where, under the auspices of some federal department, they've been creating news stories, not labeling them as government produced, and disseminating them to various TV stations and radio stations throughout the land. So in fact, I think that they're quite the same. And yet what's really different is in the last 50, 60 years, the news media has changed, and the conception of the relationship of the news media as being independent and not an institution of government or that will go and follow the dictates of government, even during wartime. And that was part of what was so important about the Pentagon Papers case.
Just to follow up on your point, Robert, my understanding is in the Office of War Information in World War II, none of the stories or information that was processed out of that office was ever planted without indication that it was a government product, where in the current situation, as I understand it, we have stories that have appeared as if they were the product of private journalistic effort, but in fact they were prepared by U.S. military sources.
That's right.
Right. And you mentioned the Pentagon Papers case, you know, the celebrated revelation through the leaks from the federal government about what was going on in the Vietnam War.
Right.
In this case. Well, there is this problem of the fine line between propaganda and genuine information from an independent source. I'm struck by the observation of one of the founders of your field, Walter Lippmann, the great specialist on American communication and public opinion, who once wrote that we must remember that in time of war, what is said on the enemy's side of the front is always propaganda, and what is said on our side of the front is truth and righteousness. Do you see in this particular controversy an issue surrounding what's regarded as truth and falsehood, or do you feel that it's really about an operational decision by the government that was wrong-headed and mistaken in its application?
Well, one of the other lessons that comes out of, maybe that even predates the Second World War, is the notion that the first casualty of war is truth itself. That was said, I believe, by Senator Hiram Johnson in the First World War. And it seems to me that that observation is particularly relevant in this particular situation today. And I think that the notion that one side is what one side says is propaganda, the other side what the other side says is truth. This is really something that has been severely compromised in this conflict. I think that, again, the idea that the media should play a role in democracy in Iraq, that this is something that we teach our students about this relationship, and there's a certain ethical standard that we have to uphold in this particular case. And in this case, it seemed that contracting with the Lincoln Group to plant stories, to have the stories written by the military or by the Lincoln Group itself that are run in the Iraqi media without attribution, this undermines certainly it undermines the stated goal of the war, whatever the ethics of that is.
And as I understand it, the contracting with the Lincoln Group, other public relations firms, that was initially all done in secret. It's been revealed through investigative stories. It's not as if this was announced or foregrounded by the government.
Right. Yeah. You know, the issue, it seems to me, is one of attribution. Nobody disputes the ability and maybe even the ability of the government to make its case. The point is that without attribution, without basically saying who has produced this stuff, and it really undermines the credibility of the journalists. And if you're thinking about creating a democratic transition in Iraq, the independence of the journalists is incredibly important. And what's happened in some sense there is that this Lincoln Group Department of Defense initiative has undermined the possibility of a free press. Why should any Iraqi believe what they read?
Right, it compromises any future communications.
Right.
Well, we have a minute or so left. What, in your minds, what would be the best outcome? What would be the best response from Senator Warner and his colleagues in Washington in response to this letter that you and your colleagues drafted?
I think what we're hoping to see from this letter is, first of all, we'd like to see Senator Warner and his committee say that this practice is wrong and will stop. And secondly, we want the American public to know more about what has occurred. So we want some kind of public airing about what has transpired and why.
Another area that's important to talk about is one of transparency. So much of what the government has been doing in this last few years since 9/11 is not transparent, and that's justified on national security grounds. Many of the issues around the Patriot Act, about intelligence, they really raise questions about what kind of information should be out there during wartime. I'd like to have that be a national debate.
Just to conclude and to emphasize your point as I understand it, the controversy around the war is not the issue. In other words, in World War II, obviously, there was a high degree of conformity in attitudes about the war. There were some dissenters, but quite few. Here we have a war that's quite divisive in the American public, but you're not suggesting that's the operative issue. It's the practice wholly itself.
We're not focusing on the righteousness or morality of the war. We believe that this practice is wrong. It would be wrong here. It's wrong over there as well.
Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. My guests have been Robert Horwitz and Gary Fields of the Department of Communication here at UC San Diego. And that wraps it up for this edition of The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein. Thank you for joining us. Good night.